The autumn of 1883 had not been kind to the Bitter Creek drainage. 3 weeks of cold rain had loosened the clay face of Sulphur Ridge until, on a Thursday morning in early October, 40 yards of hillside let go at once, carrying pine roots and red earth, and 20 years of settled quiet down onto the narrow bench above Nora Voss's property. She heard it from inside the cabin. A low groan first, the kind a mountain makes when something old gives way, and then a sound like rushing water, though no creek ran that high. She pressed her back against the interior wall and waited for the sound to stop. The window on the north side went dark with moving earth. The cabin shuddered once as if clearing its throat, and then the sound faded and silence returned, and with it the particular stillness that follows a thing that cannot be undone. She stood for a long moment with her hand flat against the pine wall, feeling for anything else. There was nothing. She put on her coat and went outside. Nora had paid $2 for that cabin in September at the Garfield County tax auction in Rawlins. The county clerk had announced it from a platform outside the courthouse steps on a Tuesday morning when the air already carried the smell of coming cold, reading from his list in the flat voice of a man who has read too many lists. A derelict single-room structure on Sulphur Ridge, title clouded, back taxes unpaid for 11 years, access by foot trail only. He had paused before he read it, as if the listing embarrassed him, and then he had said the minimum bid was $2 and looked up to see if anyone was going to trouble him. There were perhaps a dozen men at the auction. Ranchers from the drainage, a speculator from town who was buying anything offered for under $50, 2 brothers who had come down from the Medicine Bow Range looking for winter pasture. They had all looked at the listing and looked at each other and done the arithmetic that any reasonable man would do. A cabin with clouded title and 11 years of unpaid back taxes and no road access was a liability, not an asset. The speculator had shaken his head. One of the Medicine Bow brothers had made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Nora had stood at the back of the crowd and raised her hand and named the price. The silence that followed had a specific texture, not hostile exactly, closer to the particular stillness of men who have decided they are about to be proven right, who are already composing the sentence they will use to describe the moment to someone else later that week. The clerk wrote her name in his ledger. The speculator looked at her the way men look at things they cannot categorize. She folded the receipt into her coat pocket and walked out into the September dust with a deed to something everyone in Garfield County agreed was worthless. She was 28 years old, and she had learned from her father that worthless was a word men used when they had not looked carefully enough. Her father, Edmund Voss, had spent 30 years as a stonemason in the Sweetwater country. He had not been a man of many words, but the words he had were precise, and he had given her the best of them. A foundation tells the truth when the walls above it lie. Stone does not forget what it was asked to carry. The most important thing a mason's eye can learn is the difference between a structure built to last a season and a structure built to last a generation. He had taught her to read stone the way a doctor reads a face, to look past the surface to what lay beneath it, to understand that the earth keeps things longer than men do, and that walls built to hide something often become the only proof that the thing existed. He had died of a lung ailment 2 years before, in the house on the South Fork where he had lived since Nora's mother passed. He left her his tools in a canvas roll, his 3 ledgers of technique and reference, the worn leather strap he used to hone his chisels, and a disposition toward patience that her neighbors in Carbon County had sometimes mistaken for slowness. She did not correct them. Patience and slowness feel the same from the outside. The difference is only in what you are doing while other people wait. She had come to Rawlins that autumn with $43 and the tools rolled in canvas in the bed of a borrowed wagon. The cabin on Sulphur Ridge had cost her 2 of them. The remaining 41 she kept in a tin box under the floorboard, because the land around Rawlins in 1883 was full of men who understood opportunity and called it something else when it was not their own. If you have ever watched a woman buy a thing the world has already thrown away, you know the silence that follows. Stay with this story. What the mountain gave up that October morning was more than earth. The cabin itself was in rough shape when she first walked the trail up to it in late September, but not so rough as the auction listing had implied. The roof had held, through the intervention of a stone chimney stack that her father would have recognized as the work of a man who had built many chimneys and built this one to outlast the roof it served. The interior walls were smoke-blackened pine. The caulking crumbled out between the boards in long gray streaks. The floor was hardwood planking, dry and sound despite the years, laid with a care that surprised her. Each board set tight to its neighbor, the grain running the long axis of the room, the kind of floor a man lays when he expects to stand on it for a long time. She noted all of this the first day, the way her father had taught her to note things. Systematically, without conclusion, filing each observation in the private ledger of her attention before she moved on to the next. The chimney told her one thing. The floor told her another. Both said the same. Someone had built here not for a season, but with some intention of permanence. The question was why such a man had walked away from a place he had built this carefully and left it to 11 years of back taxes and brush. She spent the first 2 weeks making the place habitable. She rechinked the north wall with a mixture of sand and clay and pine pitch, working from the bottom up, pressing the new caulking in with her father's smallest trowel. She pulled the 3 rotted roof boards on the east side and replaced them with timber she carried up the trail on her back, 2 boards at a time, which meant 11 trips over 3 days. She cleared the brush from around the foundation, working with a mattock in the hard-packed clay soil, cutting roots and pulling them free, revealing as she went a stone foundation of such quality that she stopped working and stood back and looked at it for a long time. It was Colorado limestone, the same formation that ran through the bluffs on the far side of the drainage. Her father had quarried it on 2 commissions and spoken of it with the particular admiration he reserved for materials that repaid careful handling. The foundation stones had been set in a running bond with the corners cut and fitted, the mortar joints narrow and clean, the whole structure bedded deep enough in the ground to survive the frost heaving that destroyed most foundations in this country within a decade. It was not the foundation of a temporary cabin. It was the foundation of a building meant to stand. She thought about that while she worked. The cabin was small and spare, the kind a man puts up quickly when time presses. The foundation was the work of someone who had expected to stay. The 2 things did not match, and mismatches in a structure her father had taught her were always worth understanding. The landslide answered the question she had not yet known to ask. When the earth settled that Thursday morning, she walked out the front door and around the north side of the cabin to the rear slope. The hillside had given way in a rough rectangle, perhaps 40 feet across and 20 feet deep at the center. The clay face peeled back cleanly by the weight of water that had been working into the seam above it for 3 weeks. The slide debris had come down to the east, missing the cabin's foundation by perhaps 8 feet, which she noted without sentiment as a piece of luck she did not intend to examine too closely. What it had exposed on the hillside itself was what mattered. At first she thought it was more stonework, a natural ledge exposed by the moving clay. She walked closer, stepping over the debris, and saw that the stone was dressed, not natural, and that set into it was a frame of heavy timbers that had been coated in pine pitch so thoroughly they had gone almost black with age. The timbers were sound. Set into them on iron hinges mortared directly into the surrounding stone was a door, not a cave mouth, not a mine at it. A door built and hung with precision, 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, closed and locked. Nora stood in the cold October air for a long time and looked at it. The pine pitch on the timbers had done its work for years out of the reach of weather, and the iron hinges showed only a faint surface rust that would not have prevented them from moving. The door itself was pine board, battened with the boards set vertically and the batten cross-cut for strength. It was the door of someone who had thought about what they were building and why. The lock was a lever tumbler mechanism, the kind fitted to bank vaults and secure freight depots in the 1870s, set into a plate of wrought iron that had been mortared flush with the surface of the door. She leaned close to read the manufacturer's mark, a small stamped eagle above 2 initials, and recognized it as the work of a locksmith named Crane, who had operated a firm out of Cheyenne between 1868 and 1879. She knew this because her father had corresponded with Crane's firm on a commission requiring a mortise lock for a stone vault in Laramie, and she had filed the letter herself the year before he died, in the box where he kept his business correspondence. She had a good memory for correspondence. She went back inside the cabin and found her father's pick set in the canvas roll. It was a set of 5 picks, graduated in width and curve, made by a toolmaker in Denver at her father's specification. Their handles wrapped in leather cord that had been replaced twice and was starting to go at the second wrap. She took the smallest 2 and a lantern and went back to the hillside. The afternoon light was going by then, and the temperature had dropped sharply. She set the lantern on a ledge she cleared with her hands from the slide debris, wedging it between 2 stones so it would not tip, and crouched before the lock plate. The lever tumbler was a 4-gate mechanism, as she had guessed from the size of the plate, and she began the slow work of understanding it. Her father had not taught her lockpicking specifically. He had taught her the underlying principle, which was that any mechanical system has a sequence and a logic, and that the path to understanding it is to listen with the instrument you are using, to learn its resistance before you learn its yield. She applied this now, working the first pick through the keyway to find the gates, reading the tension in the lever stack, mapping in her mind what she could not see. The false gates declared themselves by their excessive yield, too easy, and she set them aside. The true gates gave themselves up only under a precise angle and a steady tension that had to be held exactly while the pick advanced. She worked until the lantern oil ran low and the cold had gone from uncomfortable to something that required attention. She stood, flexed her hand, and walked back inside to warm it over the stove. She ate what she had, a piece of bread and some cold beans from the morning, and thought about the mechanism. The bolt throw was longer than standard, perhaps half again what a typical 4-gate would use, which was not a design she had seen before. A custom specification. Someone had ordered this lock for a specific purpose, at additional cost, from a firm in Cheyenne that did not commonly receive custom orders. In the morning, she started again at first light. The 2nd gate took most of the morning. The 4th gate, which held the bolt, took the afternoon. She had been at it for parts of 2 days when, in the late afternoon light of the 2nd day, the tension she had been maintaining on the lever stack finally found its equilibrium, and the bolt drew back in a single smooth movement, and the door swung inward on its iron hinges without a creak. The cold air that came out of the hillside was extraordinary. Not the damp cold of a cave, but the dry, sealed cold of a room that has been closed for years. The kind of cold that means nothing has disturbed the air inside that space in a very long time. She held the lantern up and looked before she stepped inside. The room was perhaps 12 feet square. The walls dressed stone laid with the same running bond and tight joints as the foundation outside. The ceiling was heavy timber, rougher than the walls but sound, the undersides of the beams dark with the same pine pitch that had treated the doorframe. The floor was packed earth covered with canvas sheeting that had gone stiff and dry with age. The original cream of the canvas faded to a pale brown. Along the right-hand wall, a set of wooden shelves held what she counted as 30 ledger books, their spines upright and ordered, the leather covers intact, dated in a careful hand from 1851 through 1879. Along the left-hand wall, a flat stone surface set on two low pillars served as a table, and on that surface, weighted down by a single iron bar so that it would not shift, lay a folded document sealed with wax, a name written on its outside in ink that had faded almost entirely to the color of the stone beneath it. In the center of the room, on its own low platform of dressed stone, sat a strongbox, heavier than the door mechanism, newer. Its surface a matte black iron with a combination wheel on the face. She stood at the threshold and did not go in. This was her father's teaching from the first time he had taken her into a building he was assessing for a commission. Stand at the edge first. Look at what is in front of you before you move through it. The woman who reaches before she sees will break what she came to find. What she saw was a room that had been built with intention and that had waited with patience. The ledger books ordered by year, the strongbox on its platform as if displayed, the sealed document on the table with a name written on the outside. She could read the name from the doorway. Holt. She knew that name. Everyone in the Bitter Creek country knew that name. Cyrus Holt had run the Bitter Creek Land and Cattle Company out of an office in Rawlins between 1871 and 1879. In those 8 years, he had acquired approximately 40,000 acres of territory through purchases, options, and negotiated transfers that the county recorder had processed and filed without comment. Because Cyrus Holt was a man who understood that paperwork filed quietly is paperwork that is never questioned. He was described in the territorial press of those years as an energetic developer of the Sweetwater country, a phrase that men like Holt tended to apply to themselves and that journals in need of advertising revenue tended to repeat. He had left the territory in the autumn of 1879, shortly after the death of his business partner, a man named Arthur Grieve, whose ranch at the head of the Bitter Creek drainage had been absorbed into the Holt holdings 2 weeks after Grieve's death, on the basis of a deed of sale that Grieve's widow had not been able to produce from her own papers, because she claimed to have never signed one. Holt had sold the Bitter Creek holdings to a Denver firm in 1881 and retired to Kansas City. The widow Grieve, whose name was Delia, had been dispossessed of the home ranch in 1880. She lived now in a rented room above the dry goods store in Rawlins, 71 years old, and she had been telling anyone who would stay long enough to hear her that the deed of sale bearing her signature was a forgery. She had been telling them for 3 years. There was no other record. There was no proof. No one had listened. Nora Vass stood in the October cold outside a sealed door and understood that the room in front of her had been built by someone who knew what Holt had done and who had not lived long enough to use what he had preserved inside it. She went in. She spent the rest of that afternoon reading Arthur Grieve's ledgers, 30 years of ranch accounts written in a clear, deliberate hand, organized by season, each entry dated and precise, cattle numbers by breed and age, land improvements made and materials used, water rights negotiated, and the names of the men on the other side of each negotiation, wages paid to hands who were named in full. A man who kept accounts this way was a man who expected to answer for them. He had built a thing and documented it, and the documentation was as careful as the stonework. The last entry in the final ledger was dated September 14th, 1879. 3 days before Arthur Grieve died of a riding accident on his own property. It read, I have placed the original deed and the survey record in the strongbox. Holt has offered to buy. I have declined. I do not trust the terms he proposes or the men he has brought into the territory this season. If something befalls me, whoever finds this room will find also the proof of what this ranch is and what it cost to build. My wife knows the combination. Her name is Delia. She will know what to do. The strongbox had a combination wheel rather than a key mechanism. Nora noted this, set down the ledger, and sat for a moment on the packed earth floor of that sealed room with her hands on her knees. Then she wrapped the ledger back in its place and rose and walked back down the trail to the road that ran into Rollins. She needed Delia Grieve. There is a certain kind of woman who has lived long enough with an injustice that she has come to carry it, not as rage and not as grief exactly, but as a weight she no longer notices because she has been carrying it so long. The flat endurance of someone who has outlasted the men who dismissed her, but has not yet outlasted the wrong they did. Delia Grieve was that kind of woman. She was small and white-haired, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of a body that has kept a record of its years. And she looked at Nora across the small table in her rented room above the dry goods store, with eyes that had not gone vague with age, and had not gone soft with it either. "You found the room?" she said. It was not a question. "I found the room," Nora said. Delia set down her cup. Outside the window, the dry goods store's awning moved in a gust of October wind. "Arthur told me where he had put it," she said. "He told me in the summer before he died. He was worried about Holt, the way Holt's men were watching the road in and out of the ranch. He said if anything happened, the cabin was just the front of it, that he had built something behind." She was quiet for a moment, her hands on the table, still. "I couldn't find the door. I looked for 2 years before they put me off the property. The hillside had come down a little in the spring of 1878. Not like this, but enough to cover the frame." She looked at her hands. "I could not find it, so I stopped looking." "I need the combination to the box," Nora said. Delia told her. The combination was the name of the creek where Arthur Grieve had filed his first water claim in 1860, the year before he proved up on the ranch. Crow, spelled across 4 letter wheels. Nora returned to Sulphur Ridge the following morning, knelt on the cold earth of the sealed room in the light of her lantern, and set the wheels. The strongbox opened on the first attempt. Inside were 3 documents. The first was the original deed to the Grieve Ranch, dated 1861, signed by Arthur Grieve before 2 witnesses whose names appeared in the county clerk's record for that year. It described 4,230 acres along the Bitter Creek drainage in survey language that was specific and complete. The second was the survey plat prepared by a licensed territorial surveyor in 1862, bearing his seal and the countersignature of the General Land Office agent in Cheyenne. The third was a letter. Nora recognized Holt's handwriting from a document she had pulled from the county recorder's file when she was tracing the title history of the Sulphur Ridge benchland in September, because Holt's name appeared in that chain of title in 1876, and she had wanted to understand it. The letter was addressed to a man named Everett Cass, who had served as Garfield County's deputy recorder between 1877 and 1880. It instructed Cass to remove the Grieve deed of sale from the recorder's index and replace it with a document that Holt enclosed, filing the replacement as if it had been received in the ordinary course of business. In return, Holt named a specific consideration: $200 in cash to be paid on the day the replacement deed was recorded and confirmed. Arthur Grieve had obtained that letter. She did not know how. He had not lived to use it. Nora sat on the packed earth floor and read it twice. Then she folded it with the deed and the survey plat and wrapped all three in the dry canvas sheeting, because the documents had already waited 11 years and could wait one more night without harm. She walked into Rawlins the following morning early, before the frost had left the trail, and went directly to the office of the United States Land Commissioner. The commissioner's name was Aldrich. He had been appointed to the position from outside the territory 18 months earlier, and was known in Rawlins as a man who kept his own hours and answered his own correspondence and owed his position to Washington rather than to any interest in Wyoming territory. Nora had identified him 2 weeks earlier, when she was researching the title to the Sulphur Ridge property, as the correct person to approach if she found what she suspected was inside the room. She set the documents on his desk and stood back and let him read them. Aldrich read carefully. He turned each page with the attention of a man who understands that what he is looking at may require him to act, and who intends to understand it fully before he decides what to do. When he finished the last page, he set it down flat with both hands and looked at her without expression for a moment. "Where did you find these?" he said. She told him. She described the room, the door, the lock, the shelves of ledgers, the strongbox and its contents. She described the visit to Delia Grieve and the combination. She spoke without elaboration because the documents spoke well enough for themselves, and she had not come to tell a story, but to place a proof in the hands of the correct authority. Aldrich called in his clerk and dictated a wire to the territorial attorney's office in Cheyenne, summarizing the finding and requesting guidance on jurisdiction. He called in a second clerk and dictated a separate wire to the Denver firm that currently held the Bitter Creek Ranch title, notifying them that the foundational deed in their chain of title was under formal review by the Land Commissioner's office, and that no further conveyance or encumbrance of the property should proceed pending that review. He then wrote a third document in his own hand, addressed to the current Garfield County clerk, requesting the complete records of Everett Cass's tenure as deputy recorder, including all instruments recorded during that period and any correspondence in the office file. He did all of this without hurry and without apparent excitement, in the manner of a man who has worked with documents long enough to understand that the quality of what you are looking at does not change what it requires of you, which is simply that you do the correct thing in the correct order without delay. When he was done, he looked at Nora again. "I will need you to make a written statement of how you came to acquire the property and how you found the room and what you observed inside it," he said. "I would like it by end of week." "You will have it," she said. The sheriff's office did not empty in a single afternoon. These things move at the pace of paper, and paper in 1883 moved at the pace of riders and railway cars, and the willingness of men at various stops along the line to do their part of the work without being prodded. Everett Cass had not served as deputy recorder for 3 years by then. He had left the county clerk's office in 1880 under circumstances described in the record as a voluntary departure, and was operating a freighting business out of Rock Springs. It took the territorial marshal 2 weeks to locate him and another 2 for the relevant documents and depositions to be assembled and transmitted. In that interval, Nora repaired the remaining section of the cabin roof, remortared the chimney flashing against the winter, and lined the shelves of the sealed room with oilcloth to protect Arthur Grieve's ledgers from the condensation that would come with the cold. She had not decided yet what to do with the room beyond keeping it. It seemed, in a practical sense, useful. Delia Grieve was present the afternoon the territorial marshal came to Rawlins to oversee the formal re-recording of the Grieve deed. She sat in a chair in Aldrich's outer office, her stick propped against the wall beside her, and watched a clerk copy Arthur Grieve's original deed into the county record under its proper date and proper grantor, voiding the fraudulent instrument that Everett Cass had filed in its place in November of 1879. She did not weep, She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes open, and when the clerk set down his pen and blotted the entry, she said in a voice that was level and entirely clear, he would have done it himself if he had been given the time. No one in the room offered to dispute it. The Denver firm that held the Bitter Creek title had purchased it in good faith from Holt's Holding Company in 1881 without knowledge of the fraudulent foundational instrument. The territorial attorney's determination, rendered in January of 1884, found that the firm's title was encumbered beyond cure by the fraud at its origin and could not stand as conveyed. The firm's attorneys, who were not unreasonable men, understood what the alternative was: a full contest in territorial court, with Holt's own letter directing the falsification of a county record entered as the central exhibit, and the combined weight of the original deed and the survey plat, and 30 years of ranch ledgers on the opposing side. The settlement they reached with the Grieve estate, administered by the county probate court on Delia's behalf, was generous by the standards of what the territory's courts tended to produce in these matters. Cyrus Holt, by then settled in Kansas City, was notified by the territorial attorney's office of the finding of fraud and the specific instrument that established it. The letter was formal and made no threats. Holt's response, received 6 weeks later, disputed nothing. His name was entered in the territorial land record as the originator of a fraudulent conveyance in Garfield County in 1879. The entry has not been removed. Everett Cass appeared before the territorial court in Cheyenne in February of 1884 on a charge of official misconduct. The judge fined him $250, which was $50 more than Holt had paid him for the service, and barred him permanently from holding public office in the territory. Cass paid the fine and returned to his freight wagons in Rock Springs and was not heard from again in Garfield County. The sheriff's office in Rawlins had 4 deputies in the autumn of 1883. By spring it had 2. The territorial marshal's inquiry into the office's relationship with Cyrus Holt's operations in the 1870s did not fully resolve every question it opened, but it found sufficient evidence of an informal arrangement between 2 of the deputies and Holt's Land Company during the period of the Grieve acquisition to recommend their termination, and the county commissioners accepted the recommendation. Sheriff Pendleton, who had taken the office in 1881 and been careful throughout his tenure never to open the question of the Grieve deed or the widow's complaint, submitted his resignation in March of 1884. The county commissioners accepted it the same afternoon and appointed an interim. Nora did not follow any of this closely. She had placed the documents in the hands of the correct authority and answered his questions and provided her written statement, and that was where her part of the formal process ended. The machinery of the territory operated at its own pace and didn't require her participation to grind, and she had a winter's worth of work ahead of her that would not wait on proceedings in Cheyenne. She put in a proper door on the sealed room before the first hard freeze, a door of her own making from salvaged timber and iron fittings she shaped with her father's hammer and files, and she hung it on hinges of her own cutting and fitted it with a lock of her own making, because a room that had held what this one had held deserved a lock that had not been made by someone else. She shelved all 30 of Arthur Grieve's ledgers properly in order and wiped their covers with a cloth dampened in linseed oil to condition the leather against the dry cold. The strong box she left on its stone platform, unlatched, the lid standing open. It had served its purpose. It could serve a new one now. There is a peculiar satisfaction in a thing built to last that has, in fact, lasted. A room built to hold a truth in trust until the right hand came along had done exactly what it was built to do. The fact that it had taken 11 years and required a landslide to make itself findable was, from a certain angle, something her father would have called a reasonable delay. Stone does not hurry. The truth, in her experience, is no different. Delia Grieve came out to the cabin once that winter in December, on a day when the snow had settled the benchland to a white quiet, and the pines on the ridge held their branches heavy and still. She walked the trail slowly with her stick, and Nora walked beside her on the uphill side in case the ground was slick, though she did not say so, and Delia did not ask. At the door to the sealed room, Delia stopped and stood for a time without going in. "He built it himself," she said finally. "He never told me what it cost him in time or effort, building that in secret while Holt's men were watching the road." She put her hand on the doorframe, the treated timber that had held it set for 11 years in the hillside. "He was a careful man." "He was," Nora said. Delia's hand rested on the timber a moment more. Then she went inside, and Nora followed, and they sat at the flat stone table, with tin cups of coffee and the lantern burning between them in the dry, sealed air, and neither of them said anything more that needed saying. Nora spent the better part of the following spring and summer working the benchland around the cabin, clearing the slide debris and beginning to understand the ridge beneath it. She had suspected since reading the foundation that the limestone deposit under the clay was more extensive than the county's surface assessment implied. She was right. The seam ran clean and consistent for perhaps 200 feet along the slope beneath where the slide had exposed it. Colorado limestone of the same formation as the bluffs on the far side of the drainage, dense and close-grained, and worth considerably more as quarried building stone than the assessed value of the land it sat under. She filed a materials claim with the General Land Office in May of 1884, paid the $4 filing fee, and began working the seam with her father's quarry tools, a point chisel, and a set of wedge irons and a 12-pound sledge whose handle she had replaced twice since his death, but whose head she had never changed because the steel was good and there was no reason to. She split the first dressed stone in June and carried it down the trail on a sledge she built from 2 pine poles and an old wagon board, and she took it into Rawlins and left it at the builder's yard on the main street without a price attached, because she wanted someone who knew stone to look at it without knowing what she was asking for it. The builder, a man named Cope who had worked in stone before he came to Wyoming and knew what he was looking at, sent a note to the Sulphur Ridge Trail, head within the week. He named a figure for dressed stone by the cubic foot. She sent a note back. They met, and the figure they agreed on wasn't the one he had named in his first note, but it was fair, and Cope paid on delivery without argument, which in her experience was the only characteristic of a buyer that mattered more than the price. By September, she had filled 1 contract. By the following spring, she had 2. The year after that, she hired a hand, a quiet young man named Dix, who had come out of the Uinta Basin and could use a quarry bar correctly the first time she showed him, which was the most she required of anyone she worked alongside. The cabin was never large. She did not need it to be. She had the sealed room for her tools and her records, and the front room for living, and the view from the bench across the Bitter Creek drainage to the red bluffs on the far side, which changed color through the day from clay orange at noon to a deep rust at evening that she found, without ever quite saying so to anyone, to be worth $2 several times over. Delia Grieve died in the spring of 1886 in the rented room above the dry goods store. The settlement from the Denver firm had allowed her to clear what she owed and to live without the arithmetic of debt pressing on each month. And this was what the restitution had actually given her. Not a ranch restored, which was beyond restoring, but the removal of a weight she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it. Nora attended the service in the Methodist chapel and sat in the back and listened to the preacher say what was expected. And when it was done, she walked the trail back up to Sulphur Ridge because there was work to do, and the seam would not what. The sealed room behind the cabin is still there, as far as the record shows. The door Nora made from salvaged iron and pine is still on its hinges, and the stone walls her father would have recognized are still standing, though the hill above them has been quiet for many years and shows no particular intention of moving again. The 30 ledgers that Arthur Grieve kept through 3 decades of building a ranch in the Bitter Creek country were transferred eventually to the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne, where they sit in a labeled box in a climate considerably less stable than the one he built for them. The strong box is there still on its stone platform, the lid standing open and the interior empty. It held what it was made to hold for exactly as long as was required. If you have known someone who kept a truth in trust for a long time, waiting for the right hand to find it, you understand something about what that patience costs and what it gives back. Leave a word about it if you are inclined. There are other stories in these hills, and none of them are short. This is a work of historical fiction, drawing on the conditions of land fraud and public record manipulation in Wyoming Territory in the 1870s and 1880s. The characters, the cabin, and the sealed room are invented. The machinery that made such frauds possible was not.